So a surveyor needs to prepare maps and adjust the coordinates of new location, i.e. determine new campus parking yard, and then they added that image. So he usually uses this formula, as you can all see. Now he needs you to design a Python program to simplify his work in calculating the value of D. So ensure that all values of x1, x2, y1, y2 are entered from the keyboard, and these are the values. So there are no restrictions attached to this for this number. So the best programming practices, you always work with functions, especially for such programs. So I hope we are conversant with functions. If we are not, we can always learn. So they are telling us that we ensure that all values are entered from the keyboard. So when it comes to programming, there are always different approaches of solving a problem. So for example, for this part, if we are to work, I'm renaming this file to Python. So for example, if we are to work with a basic program that is going to calculate the value of D. Calculate D in a way that we are not using a function. So sometimes a question can come in a way that it is specific, and other questions can come in a way that they are open. You can use any approach. So the common approach, we are going to first of all, we see that this expression of ours is working with variables first. So before even we try to define or to declare the expression D, we have to cater for the variables it is working with. And take note of the fact that they are telling us that they are being entered from the keyboard. So for me, when I analyzed this problem, I saw that the values x1 and x2 were of type int. Do we know about data types? Hey guys, the session has to be interactive. This is not an exam. So me, I saw that x1 and x2 were int, of type int, integers, right?
Gorret?
Yes.
What if they are floats?
Auntie, it's what I want to talk about. Cases whereby, for example, you have x1. X1 is 50. Then x2 is what? 20.
20.
And y1 is
150.5.
150.5 and y2
98.8.
So for me, what I was saying that most of the times if you are working with data that is coming from the user, now for this case, we know that generally if you're to capture information that is coming from the keyboard, it comes in a way that the data type is always of type string. There are always strings that we get from the keyboard. So for this case, me, when I saw that they are specifying the values of x1 and x2, whereby these ones are integers, they're of type int, and y1 and y2 are floats. So I was thinking of the fact that if I am to capture, for example, if we define x1, and you know the first thing we have to do is to prompt the user to enter the x1 value. For example, enter the value of x1. Then I work with the escape sequence with \t to add some space. So generally, whenever you are working with such a function input, have you heard about the type? When you say print type of x1, and we try to run this program. So if I say, we know that maybe 50.
Supposed to show the type.
I'm trying to show you that whenever you are working with the input function, in other words, you are trying to read a string from the standard input, in other words, that you are trying to collect data from a user. The data type of the value that the user submits is always a string. So you're seeing class str, meaning that it is a string. Str denotes a string. So that means that anytime you are getting a string, you always have to cast the data. So casting, we can see that they are telling us that x1 is 50, meaning that we have to convert this 50, which is being provided by the user, to a different data type. And for this case, if this is a 50, so we shall assume that this must be an integer. So for us to be able to cast it, so this was just showing you the type. You bring in int. So the int, let me try to add a comment here. So we have the int function, which is a constructor, or in other words, a function that is used to change the data type, for example, a string or a float to integer type. So for example, for this case, we are getting a string. So for us to be able to convert this 50 from a string to an integer, we use this constructor. So these ones are always called constructors. And if you're to research further more about this, you check out typecasting. That concept is called typecasting. So typecasting is like the process of converting a variable from one data type to the other. I hope that makes sense to everybody. So now when we are to capture this value for x2, it should be the same case. We just change the string literal. A string literal is like a user-defined sentence. Enter the value of x2. And now for y1 and y2, let's say y1 and y2. Update this to y1. So to be consistent, I'll update these ones to uppercase and also this. So now for me, for this case, with the fact that y1 and y2 values were floats, I was trying to make sure that if I am to cast, I am casting this in a way that I use the float constructor for this. So I changed them from string to a float because of the fact that these two values were having 50.5 and 98.8. They were having decimal places or decimal values. But sometimes you can also find someone converting this to int. But me, what I do, basing on the data that has been given to us, that is how I create a program. For me, I thought it would be better if we convert these or we cast them to float. So having we casted, so this is casting and this other casting is for float type. So whenever we have the variables in place and we are storing that data that is coming from the user, we now have to go ahead and write this expression. So this expression, I'm literally sure that right now everyone is conversant working with the models. So we shall import the models that we are going to work with here. So for you to import any model, you first say import. If it is Python, then the name. So we know we can work with the math module. Actually, it is module, because in Python there is a model, this, and a module. So a model is like a particular class with different attributes. Like a person has maybe attributes like color, height, and weight, age, etc. But now a module is like a library that has been installed now within Python, something like that. So this is a module. And sometimes you also see a module and a package in the future. yeah, package like that. So with the fact that we have imported that, we are going to see how it works. But we can see that our value for D, or this expression, is a little bit complex. So we can simplify it. I can just say, okay, it's a good practice to always comment your code such that, for example, if I was to share this program with other people, they can at least have insights about what every line of code or section was trying to do. So simplified expression. So if I just create a simple variable to simplify that expression. So there are what we call naming conventions for variables, like what are the rules that are attached in the way you name a variable. So if I'm writing my variable in this case, that means that this is a camel case naming convention. Then sometimes you can actually find someone writing it this way, in a way that they say simplified and they use an underscore. So simplified expression, then this makes it to be a snake case, and then the other naming convention, for example, if I turn the first S to an uppercase and the first E for each word, then that becomes a Pascal naming convention. So these are the naming conventions that we always work with. So if you're to name a variable or any function, you make sure that you're working within these three. So majority of the developers, they work with the camel, the snake case. So most of the times, if you're working with a snake case, it's not recommended for you to be mixing. Snake case, again, you bring in camel and Pascal. So in other words, when you are working with them, you stick to one. So me, generally, I work with the camel case, this one. So that is why I had created this expression like this. So we are going to go ahead and say x1 minus x2. Not forgetting that these are the values, the variables that we have declared here or defined. And now we realize that in our expression, the first difference of x1 and x2 is raised to 2 squared, right? So for us, the way we define that in terms of code, we use 2 asterisks, these stars, then 2, then plus. So most of the times I don't rewrite code. For example, this part, I have already defined it, so I can copy it and paste it here and just rename this just to save time. Yeah.
Okay.
So having we simplified this, we know that D is now a square root of this difference. So for us to bring out D, so we shall also define a variable D that is going to store the value. And now we know that we have the math model. So the math model, when you import it, it's like an object. In other words, actually, generally, I think it is a class that has different methods that you can always work with this. So whenever I add a period is like we are trying to access these other methods that belong to this module. So for this case, we are working with a square root, and it's denoted as SQ, then RT. So if it is a method, then that means that it is a function. We add the parentheses. So the parameter, so in the future, I think even Sir talked about that whenever you're working with functions, there are some functions that take in parameters and there are some functions that do not take in parameters. So we know that the square root function, it takes in a parameter of the value for which we want to find the square root. So if we say math.square root, so we want to find or to pass in this variable, simplified expression, and this is not part. So math.square root of this value. So it's also not any much different if someone says this. If instead of what we have done, someone just pastes this and just creates everything in a simple line. It's also very okay. Depending on the way you organize your code, it is still the same thing. Are we there?
Yeah.
Now, so for us to be able to run the program in a way that it displays the value of D, we have to go ahead and print. So the way we work with the input and output in terms of Python, we can use the print. So this is going to be display results. Display results. Something like that. So we can go ahead and print. So if a question is open, the way you want to print the output can differ. You can either customize it, or you can just pass in the value itself, the variable itself. So the difference is that for the first print, we are just printing D. And someone else could say, no, me, I want a customized one. So customizing it can work in a way that you want to say, for example, the value of D is, then you go ahead and pass in this value. First of all, we are going to try to print itself and its type, so that you can know the type, the data type of this variable. So I'm going to run the program so that you guys can see. So for now, I'm just going to enter random values, and then the other can be 20.1. You can see that when we ran the program, it was just printing this string without the value of D. So for you to be able to pass in the variable, there is what we call string concatenation. You can check it out. So the way we want to work with it is that we say the value of D is, so I can just use an escape sequence here. So string concatenation works in a way that we use the plus symbol. So you add a plus, then you pass in the variable, such that we say the value of D is then this, so that we can see the difference. So if I try to run, of course I'm just entering some random variables here. And so you can see the output we get, that string concatenation, but here type error. You can only concatenate a string, not a float, to a string. So what happens whenever you are working with formatting of the output, you want to make sure that whatever you are combining or formatting or concatenating, all the variables are of the same. So having we confirmed that this D is of type float, so you ask yourself, how do you convert from float to a string? So we use the str like that, such that now we convert it from a float type to a string type. Then if I try to run the application, so what I am going to do, I can clear these recent changes first, such that if we say 50, 20, 190.8, and maybe 40.3. So I think we can customize this furthermore. So let me first of all comment this out so that we can see clearly. So CLS is just a command we use to clear the recent output in the terminal. So if I rerun this, you say 50, 20, maybe 98.8. But whenever we are working with float types, you can see that a float, in a way that most of the times you can have more than one decimal value. So it is always a best practice for you to format or to work with the floats in a way that you are at least giving them decimal places to either 1, 2, or 3. For cases whereby they haven't talked about particular decimal places for the value, for example, for the value of D. So Python also has the string formatting in a way that you are using the F formatter. Have you heard about that?
No.
Actually, before I even talk about that, you can bring in this other concept still. So you can say that the value of D is this. Then we can say percentage. So we want to convert this to maybe 2. So we set to F. And then, so this is the syntax. You start with a percentage sign, percentage, then dot. Dot is like a full stop. Then the value, how many decimal places? To 2. This has to be here 2. Then F, meaning that it's going to give it 2 decimal places in a way that this is going to be type float. Then the syntax changes, pass in percentage. Then we try to call the variable, which is D, this, such that if I rerun it here, I can say 50, 20, 98.8, 60.4. So you can see that the first one, it is telling us the value of D is this, and when we format it to, or round off to 2 decimal places, it gives us the value of D is. Then the other way we concatenate sometimes, not sometimes. It's also part. There is what we call the F formatter. You say F, then you bring. So the F formatter, so this works in a way that you start with the F, then the quotes, then you say the value of D is. Now the difference with this, we use braces in a way that you want to access the variable. Then when I try to run 50, 10, 40.2. So are you seeing the difference? This, the first one and the last one are the same, just that for the first print, I think we over added tabs. Where is it? This one. So sometimes you can even just add space. This can also work, such that when I clear this and run, I'll say 50, 20, 50.1. Was this very okay with everyone?
The last explanation, I didn't get it. I said this one and this one are the same, but
I was saying line 22 and line 24 are the same. Because can you see the output? This is for line, this one. This is on line 22 and this is on line 24. They are the same. So the difference with this other one of line 23 is that we are trying to round off to 2 decimal places. So it's just a matter of understanding which approach do you want to work with. So majority of the developers, most of the times they work with this and this, but they are all recommended depending on what suits you.
That F string formatter.
Yes.
It's supposed to change everything in the brackets into a string.
Yes. So let me repeat it once again. So if you're to work with the F formatter, you start with F, then you add quotes. So anything, yes. For example, we can say Esther and a catch, right? Maybe, so if I just come and say, and I define a variable here called present, in a way that it is a string, and I just say, no, it cannot be present, it can be status. Status, and I say they are present. So Esther and Akech are present. So we know that if you're to work with this string concatenation, the common one, this one, you're going to work with the plus. But with the F formatter, we don't work with the plus. We just bring in curly braces and we call the variable that we want to pass in now.
Yes.
Yes. So with this one, you just bring in curly braces and you continue. Are present and they are fully participating, something like that. You see how it makes sense? But for string concatenation with the plus, if I want to add anything else, I'm going to add another plus. The value of D is then maybe for x1 and x2 etc. like that. To add in anything else, again you bring in the plus and define whatever you want. So same also applies to the one of line 23. They are the same. The difference of this one is just that we were trying to format.
Okay.
So are we now clear on that one? On that?
Yes.
Yeah, so we can see that we are getting the value. So the best approach we can use is the one of 23 that rounds up that value to 2 decimal places. This one. So this was a beginner approach. So most of the times you want to work with this in a way that you are using a function. So there are cases whereby you are using a function and the function is going to perform all what we have done. So you want to first of all define the function and give it a name. So maybe value of D. Sometimes a function can take in parameters or it cannot. So if they have not specified, so for this approach you can just cut this and paste all that here. So we make the the variables local variables. So if they are local variables, that means that we define these variables within the function scope. This is the indentation. So if I try to minimize, you can see that those variables are stored within this function definition. So we also need the expressions. So we are going to cut all these. Actually, anyway, same thing, as long as you understand. You can narrate it will be. So the indentation matters. So they should be within this. So the way we are printing, we can now, we shall go with this. And we shall comment all these others out. So the way you can comment, you can highlight, and on your keyboard you press Ctrl, then the slash. It automatically highlights that area.
Ctrl/.
You first highlight, then you press Ctrl, then slash at the same time. So if I paste, so whenever it is a function can have a return statement, and the return statement must always be 1. For example, you can say return D. So whenever you are defining function, make sure that you don't have 2 return statements. Sometimes someone can say return and again print. This is not true. Functions only take 1 return statement. So if you're not using a return, you maybe want to work with a print function, a customized way, or a customized output of the function, which is what we are having here. Print the value of D is this.
Okay.
So whenever you work with a function, you want to work with a function in a way that you call the function. Calling the function. So calling the function, let me just run this so that we can see the difference. Of course, the imports, they can be global. A global import is that as long as it is anywhere, we can always access it. So you see that we are not importing it here. I'm saying import math. This is just a repetition. As long as it is global on this line, global is defining it outside of any function definition or scope. You can always access it. So if I try to run, so you see that we are not getting any output. So that is because of the fact that we haven't called the function. So for you to call the function, and calling the function, we must always ensure that we are on the first line, not within the function. Because, for example, someone maybe who is learning, you can find them saying value of d, and they call the function here. This is not true, because if I try to run, you can still see that we are not getting any output. So the way we run a function is that you must move out of the function definition. So I can just maximize this and ensure that I am on this first line here. So the indentation, I edit it and I ensure that it is on the first line. Calling the function, then when you run, you can see that now the program is being run. So if I enter the values, and maybe 40.1, 20.2, so you can see that the value of d is this. So now, for example, for the test, this was open. You can either return d or you can customize. That is why I told you that it depends on the approach. So all approaches are right as long as it calculates the expected value. Like use all the programming concepts and ensure that the output is what is expected. So I hope you've learned some new things from that number.
Yeah.
So I remember last time they were telling us the first courseworks we had to redo them in a way that they were functions. So if this was what we had, it was just a matter of defining the function and put all these. So I think you can try out a case whereby the value of d is taking in. So this function, you're working with it in a way that it has no parameters, right? But you can also, find someone else having an approach whereby they're having value of d. Now I'm just going to add this as, okay, let me just say approach 2. I'm just going to give you some hints. So someone can just say, no, for me I want to work with it in a way that x1, x2, y1, y2 are parameters of the function, right? And we are not defining them here, but we are going to have this expression. I'll copy this here. And when it comes to programming, if you are working with, for example, an IDE, you can always reuse what you have created. So simplified expression, it takes in these values. And it just maybe returns d. Or it can also return what we have defined here. Print 100% this. So what happens, I'm going to first of all paste this out. Now for this function, whenever it is having parameters, for us to be able to call the function, you want to call the function in a way that you are passing in these values. Because if I say approach 2, for example, approach 2. So you can see that if we focus within the parentheses, it is telling us it needs the x1 value, x2, y1, and y2. So for you to work with this kind of function, you need what you call global variables. So global variables, you can now paste these here. What has it done? Value of d. Okay, let me recopy this. So we're only recopying the variables and we are pasting them here. Okay, so we are having this. So most of the times, for you to work with the program in a way that you're not confusing any other person who is going to go through your program, you can rename these. So for example, I can just say maybe x1. So I'm going to copy this one and paste this here and edit. So x2, something like that. Such that now if I am to call this function, actually let's try to run the program and we'll see first of all. So if we enter the values here when it runs, 10.3. So you can see that we are getting an error that this function is missing 4 required positional arguments, and they're defining for us the arguments. So you just have to always know, if depending on the approach, if you've defined the function in a way that it's taking in these parameters, when you're calling the function, you have to pass in those parameters. And for this case, the parameters, the parameters are being defined as global variables. So we say x1, x2, then y1 and y2, such that if I try to clear up this and run, so we say 50, 20, 98.8 and maybe 30.5. So you can see that it still prints this. So I'm sure if you also run the same program with the same values, the output must still be the same. Are we there?
Yes.
Yeah. So if a question was open, you can use any approach. But if a question is specific in a way that they're telling you the function must take in parameters, then that is the approach. I hope everything was okay with that.